wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no qua, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
Hello, LSA HQ. LSA, are you there?
Hello, good evening. We can hear you.
So I'm trying to speak to the Lagos Studies Control Room.
Okay. Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to know the name of the person who's looking after us.
My name is Tolulope Adela.
Thank you, Tolulope. Nice to meet you. Thank you for being here. And am I right that Wale and Akin are going to join from the same computer? Am I right?
Yes, you're very correct about that. We are joining from the same computer.
All right. I don't know if you're able to rename yourself. Ah, you've just done it. Brilliant.
Okay, we explored it, but we couldn't from here because of the limitations of words.
I think LSA has just done it for you. Thank you. Thank you, control. I think, are we all here in that case? I think so. So we'll just wait a minute or two, if you don't mind. There are many good panels on right now. I think it's fierce competition. I don't know how many people will attend. Wale, did you want to ask a question?
Yes.
No, I just
Hello.
Yeah,
Just to
please
say
go.
that I'm fine. I'm set. Hello, Kali. I'm fine.
Yes, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Wale and Akin, are you having trouble or are you in? All good?
Yeah, we're fine. Okay, we're fine.
They keep dropping out. So what, they're back in. Gents, hope we can hold on to you.
Yeah, we're fine. Can hear you. We can hear you now.
All right. So I think we can start the panel. Welcome everyone to session 10E, the final panel of this amazing conference. My name is Carly Coetzee. I'm the editor of the Journal of African Cultural Studies and the chair of the Lagos Studies Publications Committee. And I'm very happy to be here to discuss this book, beautifully produced by Bookcraft. And I think it's actually really important for this book to have come out with Bookcraft in an affordable version that Nigerians can buy, and bringing together work across the long writing career of Professor Abiola Irele. So I am going to turn to the discussants in the order that we have it on the program. So the first speaker is Oluwole Coker of Obafemi Awolowo University. Dr. Coker is an associate professor, teaches and researches African literature and literature, and he will resume as a George Foster Experienced Researcher Fellow at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation later in this year at Potsdam University in Germany. You are welcome, sir. Please go ahead, and you can speak for up to 10 minutes.
All right. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yeah, good to see everyone. Kali, good to see you again. I'm sure you are looking at my heart. That's your usual compliment. Daria, good to see you again. I think the last time we saw was in London for the Achebe conference. Was that 2018? I can't remember. Akin and Wale, how are you all doing, guys? Now, I do not want to pretend that anyone can grapple with this volume of Abiola Irelé's work in one jiffy. This work actually summarizes a brilliant career. One thing that cut across for me in this work can really easily be seen or deciphered from the blog, from the comments of various speakers, of various writers in the book. And one word strikes out. Two words strike out, if I may say, the word cosmopolitan and Renaissance. Those two words summarize who Professor Abiola Irele is. In one breath, he was a cosmopolitan. In another breath, he never joked with his Renaissance identity, which is a product of his key learning in his study of MCCA or in French literature. For me, this book is like a testament not only to Abiola Irele's career, but to the discipline that he espoused and lived and worked for. By capturing the work, the African scholar, Abiola Irele seems to be making a statement as to his expectation of what he expects the African scholar to be. In that wise, it means he expects the African scholar to be au fait, to be attuned with the discipline of literature in all its coloration. In other words, Abiola Irele's agenda as a scholar is one that takes literature as just a unified entity from which all strands can come and converge and discuss. If one looks at, for example, the current debates of decoloniality in the humanities generally, you find that in a way, Abiola Irele's idea of African humanities scholarship or African literary criticism is that our literature, our criticism cannot afford to stand alone. It is like a question, it is akin to like a globalizing poetics, in which case, for you to appreciate your literature, you need to take strands from all, welcome, Professor Olaya, we can see you. Yeah, so we need to take key learnings from all strands of the literary experience. Another thing that comes out for me is the fact that Abiola Irele locates his scholarship first in the whole essence of African cultural production. In other words, the popular imagination in Africa generates its own critical yardsticks. That is to say that the African cultural episteme located in the literature or in literary criticism can always stand side by side, to use the Achebe aphorism, that where one thing stands, another thing can stand by it. It is a question of, or it's a kind of complementarity in knowledge production. The one that nobody can escape is that his popular essay that is reproduced in this volume. That is the African imagination. What is the process of the African imagination? It states that the African imagination is generated and validated by the context of its production, by which case, ultimately, it can get tested and verified in other literatures, in other conventions of the world. But the question for me will now be the whole idea of canonization, the project of canonization, which, whether we like it or not, it's a product of the artistry or the craft of the critic. If we say this is where Abiola Irele wants the African scholar to be located, the question will be for me and for other discerning minds, what are the yardsticks? What are the critical tools the African scholar can deploy? My answer, gleaning from Abiola Irele's work, and then look from the brilliant forward by Spivak, will be that the African scholar must be widely read. The African scholar must have depth. and the African scholar must acknowledge the idea of a global episteme to which all cultural traditions, contribute to form a whole. That will be all for me for now. Thank you very much, Kali.
Thank you very much. I think we will move on to, can I just say the two gents from Ibadan, when you think your connection is stable, let me know and I will let you go right then. But in the meantime, I will go on to the speakers in the order that we have them on the program. The next speaker that we will hear today is Dr. Kolawole Olaiya, Associate Professor of English at Anderson University, South Carolina, who got his first degree in dramatic arts at the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University, his MA from the University of Maiduguri, and his PhD in drama from the University of Toronto. You're welcome, sir. Please go ahead. You have 10 minutes. Please, can you unmute and then begin whenever you're ready?
Yes, can you hear me now, please? All right,
yeah.
Thank you. Let me start by apologizing for, there's a little bit of, problem with joining you at the beginning. I apologize for that. And what I'm trying to do is that I've been trying to share the screen. And I think I've not been able to do that successfully. So if you don't see me while reading, again, if you can hear my voice, just please bear with me. The writer we're talking about, okay, I think it's okay now. I think I can see. I'd like to start by, again, by stating the obvious. Can you hear me clearly, please? Okay. Abiola Irele, that we're talking about, his book is universally acknowledged as a great literary scholar, an accomplished critic, essayist, and mentor with varied experiences in different areas of literature and art. I would like to add that is multilingualism, the ability to speak so many languages, especially the French and English, which are widely considered as part of the legacies that the British and of course the French left with us, made it possible for him to do a whole lot of things. As we would see in the book, he read most of the materials analyzed in their primary source. I mean, not in translated form. And as scholars, we all know that the kind of nuances, the kind of meaning that engaging with text in the original could really give to its interpretation. So we see that all through, especially in a work where there are so many references, rich and varied. And I think that's one of those, the ability to read from this primary impact. We see that how it's shown through the book. In my introduction, I describe him as a literary and artistic scholar. One of the things that I want us to pay attention to again is that this book is not just about literature. It's about politics. It's about culture. It's about different aspects of society. So, in other words, what the book does is that it engages with literature, culture, and what Chajumala Olaniyan called in his review of his essay, In Praise of Alienation, what he called the science, the social science of the state in Africa. And I think this is a very, very important thing that shines throughout the book. Even when Irele is engaged with literature, the nature of these engagements differ from chapter to chapter. The first chapter, which is the title, the African Scholar, sets the tone of the essay, where basically what we see is the author talking about the role of the African scholar in the world, in the Africa, in engaging with the world. This seems to be, for me, a kind of an epilogue, which you know, in a very, very interesting way, shows, in a way, even the writer, it's like, you know, this is the role African scholars are supposed to play in the world and in engaging with, you know, literature and society. And of course, for me, this records what Soyinka wrote an essay, I think, in the early 60s about the, you know, the role of the African writer, and then, you know, as people who would engage critically, not who were supposed to be song, you know, praise singers, but those who would engage productively in you know, in every aspect of society. So, but then more importantly, the situations that this author engaged with in this book, earlier, that most early African writers were engaged in. The debate in the discussion of this, you know, of his discussion in disparate and concrete realities in different aspects of Africa, reaffirms that role, the role of the artist. The role of the artist as an important historian of societal development. Almost all the essays, I mean, there are 13 essays, and one, the book, you know, contains of 13 chapters, and one, an appendix. All these essays look at the different aspects of African society, not just within Africa, again, Africa versus the world. One particular essay that, you know, stood out to me, again, this has been, I said, has been debated, you know, by so many critics, is the is essay on alienation. The essay on alienation, which was written in 1982, where you know, Abiola argues for alienation, becomes very, very important in the sense that, for me, I think it's you know, the theme runs through the whole gamut of the essay. All essays in this book, be it the quest from African philosophy, or the Black diaspora, or the poetic legacy of Amy Zuzere, or Chinua Achebe's The Hidden God, they're all dealt with the relation of human beings to their different societies and how these human beings are able to negotiate their existence. So, and the, you know, the changes, for me, what I, in my little write-up here, what I, and of course, that the way in which each generation or each society or each person engages with this alienation, you know, changes with the, again, you know, their experience, their knowledge, and then of course, there is a particular place that I want to quote in this essay, and I read. This is quoting Irele. The traditional pre-colonial culture and way of life continue to exist as a reality among us, but they constitute an order of existence that is engaged in a forced march in a direction dictated by the requirements of modern scientific and technological civilization. It also happens to be the case that Western civilization, at least in its contemporary manifestations and circumstance, provides the paradigm of modernity to which we aspire. Hence our mixed feelings, the troubled sense of acceptance and rejection of a subjective disposition that is undermined by the objective facts of our life. There is something of a paradox here, for the intensity of the ambivalence we demonstrate in our response to Europe and Western civilization is in fact a measure of our emotional tribute. It is expressive in a profound way of the cultural hold Europe has secured upon us, of the alienation it has imposed upon us as a historical fate. Now, even in the essays he analyzed, for instance, in Achebe's, Achebe or unnamed prophet, there is a sense in which this sense of alienation, this sense of leading to a new definition of morality appears in Shoyinka's work. In Achebe's The Hidden God, again, by the way, I see his analysis of Achebe's Arrow of God as one of the most brilliant that I've ever seen. In that book, we see that alienation too, brought about by external forces that kind of prodded and motivated it, and how the philosopher, the chief priest of Ulu, managed or fails to manage this alienation at various levels. And of course, we saw that the result is not good for him and then the society. So basically, again, I think what run through all these essays is that sense of the human being in a society where there are, different, at different points in time, there are forces that, shape and toss, toss these human beings hither and thither, and how they manage to survive. One particular thing, one remarkable feature of the book that I want to point out is the fact that there's so many references. What we see, this is the work of someone who has read so widely, someone with a very wide horizon. Again, I think what this man has given us, is a blueprint in so many cases for, any aspiring African scholar, and even, those who are established African scholars in their own field. Okay, that's where I'd like to stop for now.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to ask, as we let the two gents from Ibadan speak, that other speakers please turn off your camera to make their chances of a good connection better.
Oh, can I, is it okay that I go without a video?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. So let me just introduce you, Wale. So Dr. Coker and Dr. Olaiya, can I ask you to turn off your cameras while the two speakers are speaking, just to improve their connection?
Sure.
Thank you so much. And then we can come back again when they're done. So the first speaker from Ibadan is Dr. Adewale Owosheni. Dr. Owosheni teaches in the Department of Philosophy, University of Ibadan. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And his area of research interest includes African philosophy, environmental ethics, and human-animal studies. Please, Dr. Owosheni, go ahead. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. It has been a refreshing talk from the two previous speakers on Abiola Irele's The African Scholar. And of course, there is a convergence of thought or ideological production about what disciplines or subfields within the humanities should focus on, which basically implies the task of the African scholar. And one important thing I think I seem to notice in the text is how the text was able to address the issue of interrogating the post-colonial texture or determination of African literature. And to speak at large, literature covers poetry, language, philosophy, linguistics, and so on. And how it is also possible to negotiate moving beyond, the colonial, underlying colonial factor of the production of ideologies about African situation. In other words, Abiola Irele was making a lot of frantic effort to project a kind of reconstruction of ideological production, talking about the predicament of the African lived experiences, as well as the situationness of the African progress and development. Well, he also gave it a term, he called it the drama of consciousness. which more or less, to speak narrowly from the field of an African philosophy, is talking about the dialectics of identity struggle of the African scholar itself, whereby the general questions that underscores whether if an African philosophy exists, what then should inform the task of an African philosopher. I think Abiola Irele was very stern on this regarding what should be the stand of an African scholar or an African philosopher. He emphasizes the need to have an ideological imperative which addresses the contemporary issues that beface or confront Africa. This is to talk about, the challenge of social reconstruction on a general scale, that an African writing or literary production shouldn't just be one that talks about nationalism or cultural nationalism. It should transcend this to talk about how to develop a critical spirit, following the argument of Pauline Otonji, who also tried to, to make such an argument or such a position. And then for me, I think the critical question that that this brings up is a kind of underlying scholar activism that underlies Abiola Irele's notation on what the African scholar should be. And this continues to rock the foundation of African philosophical debate till date, talking about how to negotiate the idea of tradition versus modernity and how the different sorts of dichotomies that you can really think about. And I think the message from Abiola Irele's text is simple as regards what should be the driving ideological imperative of the African scholar within this circumstance of dualistic production. And that is that the African scholar should also negotiate his own idea of modernity, which will try to immerse itself within the global politics of knowledge production. And in this sense, it basically means that the kind of ideological productions on knowledge that will be produced from Africa should be seen as part and parcel of world systems of knowing, not something that necessarily give it a distinctive feature of being a different humankind or a different human species. This is very suggestive for how Abiola really goes about talking of authenticity of the African scholars' commitment to the whole issue of African predicament and so on. And I think it reiterates or it echoes Olufemi Taiwo's coinage of African indeed must be modern. And is also trying to transcend the argument of people like scholars like Kwasi Wiredu, who says in the earlier part of their scholarly reflection about whether there is an African philosophy or not, the African philosophy is still in the making. Irele's point is clear. He says African philosophy can no longer be in the making. African philosophy must set up to the task of addressing the issue of African destiny. And in the light of this, I think Abiola Irele's this African scholar is making emphasis about the production of a social theory or a kind of thought process that has a social function about how Africans should position themselves within the realms of their own immediate local experience and at the same time fit within the global reality. I would stop at this point and I hope to get some reflections from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And you are describing so many of the scholars we meet at Lagos Studies Association, scholars who are hyper-local, but with a global outlook. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Owosheni. We are moving on now to the second speaker from Ibadan, Dr. Akin Tella. Dr. Tella teaches discourse analysis, pragmatics, and literary stylistics at the Department of English at the University of Ibadan, where he also completed his doctoral studies in 2021. He's especially interested in political discourse in the media and representations of the political sphere in Nigerian literature. Thank you very much, Dr. Tella. You may go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yes.
Sorry,
so,
we can hear you.
Okay, fine. So what I would do, I'll just share my notes. I hope you can see my notes too, and then I can discuss straight from my notes, which is in form of a PowerPoint. What I was able to glean from my reading of Abiola Irele, the African Scholar, and other essays. I'll just give a title like, I thought of something of this as the title of my presentation, In Search of Reconstruction. Something quite akin to the title of that central article in the text, which is In Praise of Alienation. What I think in my opinion, Abiola Irele has transcended the level of being a critic or being an essayist. I see Abiola Irele more as an African public intellectual who is interested in the dilemma of the present and how we can operate within the logic of the present. So I'll read Abiola Irele as a public intellectual. If I'm given the license, I would reorganize the content of the book and say I'll start with the idea of alienation in the first place and put the idea of reconstruction at the other end. So at one end, you have the idea of alienation. At another end, you have the idea of reconstruction. And in between, I can fix in the other chapters, first starting with philosophy, then literature of Africa, then the music of Africa, and the writers of Africa, and the kind of philosophies and values that they project generally. Now, I think generally the context of these writings that are contained in this book, these articles contained in this book, is the post-colony, the condition of the post-colony itself. That's why here I talk about the post-colony as the context of the discourse. Colonialism, of course, is undergirded by colonial ideology. And like Raji Irele in one of his presentations will say, the center of that colonial ideology is the presentation of Africa as the locus of primitives. Okay, and we are very familiar with those kind of narratives from the works of Jefferson to the works of David Hume and others like that. And this particular quotation, which I encountered a long time ago in Davidson, this is coming from Hegel, summarizes the idea of colonial ideology generally, where Africa is viewed as a land where men are children, a land dying beyond the daylight of self-conscious history, and enveloped in the black color of night. At this point, let us forget Africa, not to mention it again, because Africa is a historical part of the world. That's Hegel being cited there by Davidson. So this summarizes the devaluation of African humanity as the center point of the colonial ideology itself. Now, how does alienation comes as a consequence of colonialism itself? We find ourselves in a post-colonial condition and we are alienated, so to say. Now, this is the way Abiola Irele in a part of the book describes what it means to be alienated in the first place. What I see from this quotation is that what is called alienation itself is the psychological embodiment of colonialism itself. How do we react in a post-colonial context to the effects of colonialism? So we read alienation as the effects of colonialism, and we are engaged in a forced march. We are in a transitory mood. We are transiting from what used to be, in quote, the authentic African culture, if there was anything authentic, because we know the way these things work, the fluidity of cultures generally. Then we are moving into another kind of modernity, from one modernity to another kind of modernity. So we are in the middle, trying to see how we can have a match of all this. So we are engaged, and it's a forceful one. So this particular quotation summarizes what is called alienation. Now, this part of the book was earlier quoted by Professor Olaiya earlier, by Professor Olaiya earlier. I want to highlight the idea of ambivalence there as a core part of what is called alienation, because our response to the European and Western civilization presently is ambivalent, because we are just caught up in the middle. We're neither here nor there. We can't go back to what used to be, in quotes, the authentic African culture. And we are trying to fix into a new modernity that does not sit well with possibly our cultural sensibilities. So that's the essence of what is called alienation. So we are in a state of ambivalence, so to say, and that stands at the core of what is called alienation, so to say. Now, what Irele does is then look at the varied responses to alienation. And the major one that they identified is Black cultural nationalism as a response to alienation. And these are some of the markers, some of the properties, the properties of Black cultural nationalism, which Abiola really sees as a foundational response to alienation. First of all, cultural nationalists tend to engage in some kind of cultural romanticism, where the traditional culture is seen as something that is purely coherent. Though that again, we can debate it, because it wasn't that all positive. There were negatives of it. There were overbearing leaders. There were wars in between. There was the endless propensity for empire formation, and there are even some kind of particulars. You know, they tend to also focus on particularisms than the universalism of humanity itself. Then people who talk about Black nationalism and canvass it as a response for alienation also seem to have this discomfiture with social changes. They think any interference of the African culture again, in quotes, will bring about a kind of cultural conflict, and that those cultural conflicts are essentially negative. Also, at the extreme of this view, they see culture as spectacle. Okay, and that was why I brought in this idea from Ogunde in 2011, which summarizes the idea of culture as spectacle a lot. It says, in our post-colonial existence, I am aware that the culture must be spectacular for it to enjoy the curiosity of the outsider, and that the culture must be dynamic for it to continue to be relevant to the needs of its people. But we have done less in using our dances, costumes, drumming styles to explore the history, culture, and environments of different parts of the country. So we haven't been able to properly appropriate aspects of our culture for our development in the logic of the present. And that's one thing that Black cultural nationalism also misses. Culture becomes mere spectacle. The deep interrogation of culture is not there. Then there is also the propensity for people who carry the badge of Black cultural nationalism to also see identity to essentialize identity. That tendency is very common, as against the anti-essentialist and social constructionist view of identity. So these are some of the attributes of Black cultural nationalism that Irele brought to the fore in some of his essays. Then he presents Imprints of Alienation, that particular essay, as a critique of Black cultural nationalism. And he sees, these are some of his critical ideas, critical comments on cultural nationalism. One says, the organic conception of culture. Okay, well, I think I've talked about some of this. Now, what he says, he critiques Black cultural nationalism a lot, and we see some of the ideas that he enunciated. If you go back to Munoz's 1980s concept of nationality of tradition too. So now that Irele does a good job at presenting, at critiquing Black cultural nationalism, what are the options that Irele propounded? The first is for us to take the moment of alienation as a decisive moment. That's why here it says we should concentrate our minds, both wonderful and intensely, upon the nature of alienation itself. Even go as far as saying that no culture in the world has not undergone one form of alienation. No colonized people in the world, across the globe, even if you go back to Europe, hasn't undergone some kind of alienation. But it depends on how you appropriate that moment for your growth and advancement subsequently. That's what determines who you are. So I read alienation as presented by Irele as a means, okay, as means, right? And then reconstruction as an end. So what he says is that look at the moment of alienation critically and try to see how you can reconstruct yourself in that context using alienation. So what are the ways Africa can be reconstructed? That's why I talk about being in search of reconstruction as the core of some of these essays. These are some of the pathways that Irele talks about the process of reconstruction for Africa. We should be wary of excessive commitment to reclamation of cultural antecedents, just like Black cultural nationalists do. We should avoid falling into the prevailing fashion in the West, which is anti-nationalism. And that's even made reference to postmodernism as an emblem of anti-rationalism, that it's not compatible with our stage of development. We have to make a recourse to the rational ideal of the Enlightenment. And that's what we cannot afford, we don't have the luxury of engaging in such anti-rationalist postures. Looking at the level of our development, the universities will have to be considered as development agents. Scholarship in Africa must have an ideological imperative. Then academic freedom must be guaranteed. Civil society should be energized as counterforce to the overbearing character of the state. Then local knowledge and the technologies they are capable to enable should be integrated into contemporary scientific modes. And then there should be an end to the estrangement of the people to the state. This estrangement of the people to the state, I guess, is also well theorized in Peter theory of two republics, and the idea of the civil republic being the domain of the former states, being the realm of illegitimacy and immorality, and that people are more connected effectively to the primordial public. And that we have to, again, look at the idea of citizenship and how we can reconfigure it so that people can detach themselves from the idea of primordial public and then key into the civic public. So that's also very important. And what can bring about this estrangement, what can bring an end to the estrangement of the people to the state? This has been also discussed with in some other ways. Simeon Lesomi talks about the dialogic politics. Chris Uredu talks about bringing about consensual democracy too. Then, I think I'm going to the final point. We should also evolve an economic system that strikes a balance between economic efficiency and social justice. On corruption, Abiola says the struggle against corruption will not be won by an appeal to vain moralism, but by a determined effort of reform that will draw its active force from the vigilance of the people. So these are some of the ideas that Abiola really presents. So for me, I see him as a public intellectual who suggests that the moment of alienation should be taken seriously and interrogated. And then the aim of that, the ideological imperative is the reconstruction of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We're now turning to the last speaker, Daria Tunka. Dr. Tunka works at the University of Liège in Belgium. Her research focuses on stylistics and African literatures with an emphasis on contemporary Nigerian fiction. She's the author of Stylistic Approaches to Nigerian Fiction and the co-editor of many books and journal issues on post-colonial literature. Her latest edited volumes are Conversations with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Narrating Violence in the Post-Colonial World. You are most welcome.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking the conference organizers, so the Lagos Studies Association, the chair of this panel, as well as my co-panelists who've just shared their thoughts on Abiola Irele's book with far more authority and legitimacy than I ever could. As you can guess, the irony of being a non-African scholar on a panel dedicated to a book entitled The African Scholar has not escaped me. But fortunately, I recently remembered that the word scholar was originally used to refer not only to a specialist or a knowledgeable person, but also to a student. So literally a student, a pupil in a school. So a scholar is not only an expert, but also a learner. So it's very much as a student, as a learner, that I'm taking part in this panel today. So in what I am going to say, there are going to be echoes, of course, with some of the issues already raised, and I look forward to discussing some of them. So the first thing that struck me about The African Scholar is its readability. So here's a book by one of Africa's most eminent scholars, in the true sense of the term, as an expert, who shows that it is possible to write academic prose that is at once sophisticated and intelligible. And because it's so clearly and elegantly written, the reader is able to properly engage with the text and with the ideas that it contains. The second thing that struck me, and which is somewhat related to the first, is that the book truly engages with its objects of study, whether they're literary, scholarly, philosophical, without resorting to obscure theories. And this methodological lucidity is, I think, sustained really throughout the book. And so I was not altogether surprised at the end of the volume to see the author refer to the present climate of literary studies, which I quote, is dominated by abstract theorizing. So the theorizing that does feature in the book always has a very clear analytical purpose, I found. And an example of this is the 6 functions of African orature, which as a statistician I found particularly helpful. And I was also happy to hear there's another statistician in this panel. So another remarkable way in which Professor Irele teaches us about the true nature of successful scholarship is how he handles the work of scholars with whom he disagrees or whose views appear dated to the contemporary reader. So he always very carefully recontextualizes ideas and resituates them in time and argues in such a way that some ideas are quietly put aside without bombastic rhetoric or unnecessary invective. Whether he's dealing with Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Alexander Crummell, or more recently Kwame Anthony Appiah, what I perceived as a reader was a real sense of empathy that is rather unusual in scholarly discourse. So ultimately, what emanates from Professor Irele's analyses is a quiet confidence and authority, which also translates into an audacity to say things as they are. A case in point is the comment in the introduction on the term post-colonial, which was mentioned by one of the panelists, and which is said to be repeated ad nauseum like mantra in study after study in academia, even as Irele reminds us throughout the book, contemporary Africa is dealing with much more pressing social and political issues. What such a position shows, I think, is really a great sense of pragmatism, which I think is really one of the most salient characteristics of the book. For example, in the essay In Praise of Alienation, which has been mentioned several times already, Professor Irele boldly states that, this is a quote again, "It is of no practical significance now to us," he means Africans, "to be told that our forebears constructed the pyramids. If today we cannot build and maintain by ourselves the roads and bridges we require to facilitate communication between ourselves, if we still have to depend on the alien to provide for us the necessities of modern civilization," and this is the end of the quote. Now, interestingly, in a later chapter of the book on Achebe's Arrow of God, the road built by the colonial administration in Achebe's novel is said to be a concrete sign of colonialism. Now, on the one hand, I think Professor Irele is right not to see any fundamental contradiction between the symbolism of the road and the fact that one might or should encourage the development of modernity in contemporary Africa in the form of efficient energy supply, infrastructure, and healthcare, as shown in the quotation. Now, on the other hand, I did sometimes wonder about the author's faith in the role of science and technology to improve the situation on the continent. More specifically, what I mean is that he first extensively discusses the role played by science and technology in helping the Europeans to dominate the world in the first place. And he also felicitously expounds on the role of social sciences and particularly anthropology in denigrating races under the guise of science. But he only very lightly touches on the potentially problematic nature of contemporary science and technology by warning us about the threat of genetic engineering in agriculture, leaving aside any extensive discussion of how science and technology might serve dubious ideological interests in the contemporary world, just as it did in the colonial period. Now, I have to say that this reading is a little anachronistic in the sense that the recent corona crisis has brought such issues, into much sharper focus, than they were before. Finally, Professor Irele's sense of pragmatism also finds a vivid and thought-provoking illustration in the essay A Political Kingdom Towards Reconstruction in Africa, which has also been discussed. And more precisely in his declaration that, and again, this is a quote, "The struggle against corruption will not be won by an appeal to vain moralism, but by a determined effort of reform," unquote. So considering the author's hope that universities might contribute to Africa's development in the future, this statement echoes Irele's insistence in the opening essay of the book on the practical responsibilities of the African scholar. Now, however, after writing that the challenges are not to be underestimated, Professor Irele then declares, and again I quote him, "Talking about priorities seems pointless, for everything needs to be done. The new Africa still has to be constructed from the ground up." I did wonder what to make of this rather depressing and general statement in a chapter that makes a point of debunking overly negative images of the continent. Now, to be more precise, where does this dire situation leave the African scholar? Despite the book's pragmatism, is the African scholar described in the opening pages merely a utopian figure that serves the same aspirational function as the biblical myth described in the chapter on Black utopia in the diaspora? And what might be the implications of such a statement for African scholars today? Or could it be that the book is deliberately pointing to the limitations of scholarship if it is not complemented by concrete action? So I have no answers, only questions, and I would be really interested in hearing any further thoughts on this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists. I just want to write a message to the Ibadan gents to see if we can get them back in. What is interesting is how much overlap there was in the presentations, but then also that we each had clear preferences in the chapters that we thought were the most useful. I want to ask a different kind of question before we go into discussion. Is anyone in the audience or one of the speakers perhaps aware of how Bookcraft managed to get these permissions? Because I think this is a fantastic model going forward to have, because many of these articles are hard to get hold of, and to have an affordable collection of great thinkers' works. I'm thinking, a book like this there's a number of authors one might want to think of that could be brought together in the same way. Is there someone in the audience from Bookcraft? Would you make yourself known if you are? It doesn't look like it. So let us see if there's anyone from the audience who would like to ask a question. I see some familiar names there. Professor Fasson, I don't know if you have a comment. Ayodele Onanuga, is that Paul? Are you the same person as Paul Onanuga? If anyone wants to ask a question you can also ask to be unmuted. LSA can unmute anyone in the audience if you want. So if you lift your hand, if you show your hand, LSA can unmute you. What sad language. Please raise your electronic hand. When will we all be together again? When we can raise our real hands? I don't know if one of the panelists maybe wanted to ask a question to one of the others. The chapter that for me or the two chapters, the pair of chapters I was most excited about was on, now I'm a little bit stressed, so I can't remember the title now, Black Utopia. The two Black Utopia chapters I just loved, and the questions he asks, that Professor Irele asks about how we understand global Blackness and the limited view of that Gilroy's work has presented. I found it really provocative and interesting. Of course, all of these articles have been available, except I think for the two Black Fantastics, Black Utopias. I don't think they've been published before, or one of them at least. Any questions or comments, please? Paul, yes. Very nice to know that you are there. You don't need to contribute, just good to know you there. We are consoling ourselves with community in this strange time. Yes, please, Dr. Coco, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask. We can't hear you. Could you unmute, please? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I said I just need to draw our attention to a fact. The fact is that beyond his intellectual adventures, one needs to have met Professor Irele in person in his real life to understand his globalized vision of the role of the African scholar. What I find very intriguing about him is the ease with which he moves across humanitarian disciplines. In other words, he tries not just to stand, okay, in his space as a literary scholar. Number one, I mean that's the first thing. Secondly, he redefines what we can call comparative outlook. His whole idea of comparative literature is not about reading it. It's about feeling it. It's about being part of it. Okay. I was reading the chapter on African music, chapter 6, when he was asking the rhetorical question: is African music possible? Is African music possible? If you see the kind of questions he raises in this chapter, you realize that these were prophetic intellectual statements of a time that we have now, where globalization and all other factors of information and communication technology will converge epistemologies. Okay, so I think that the whole idea of doing this volume by drawing all his previous phenomenal essays is to show his view of why he thinks that the African scholar must migrate from that scholar that will be in the cocoon of his intellectual space, just like my colleague, is it Akin or Wale, I noted earlier, to that space beyond public intellectualism for me. So Professor Irele's attempt in this book is to show that the task of being an African scholar is to be at the vanguard of that authentic knowledge production that can coalesce into the global pool of global politics of knowledge. I thought I should make that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Conference HQ, could you please promote Dr. Obusheni to become a speaker again? He's in the audience. Any of the other speakers who would like to make a comment, or anyone from the audience? I don't know if Professor Fasson has anything to say maybe on the possibilities of this kind of publication that I mentioned. I don't know whether you have any knowledge of how Bookcraft does these things, Professor Fasson. LSA conference, Obusheni is in the audience. Is it raining at the moment in Lagos? It didn't look like it in Ibadan. Is it raining? Let's see, there seems to be a question. His other names. No, he's just, sorry, he's called Wale. Wale Obusheni in the audience. If you make me co-host, I could do it. Oh, have you got him? Thank you. Are you back, Wale? Are you able to participate? I don't know whether you or your colleague want to say something. Yes, I see a hand. Thank you, conference, for promoting Dr. Stella Omonigo. Please unmute yourself and make your comment.
Thank you so much, Professor Kotze, if I'm Professor Kali. I'm very sorry I joined in very late, but from the little I learned from Professor Tonka, it was quite revealing and insightful. I just wanted to find out, I don't know if anyone has touched the part of the role of Professor Abiola Irele in the Francophone world. What I mean by that is that he was the first French professor in Nigeria, and his works have greatly been highly promoted among the Francophone students and Francophone scholars, literary scholars in Nigeria. So I don't know whether Professor Tonka was able to speak about some of his Francophone works as it regards the Caribbean literature. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think he was the teacher of Professor Moradeun Adejunmobi. Am I right?
You're very correct.
So there's a whole legacy that comes from that as well. Dr. Tunka, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, well, it's sort of an embarrassing question because my native language, my mother tongue is French, but I hardly know anything about French literature. So I actually learned a lot from the chapters in the book dedicated to French literature. And all literature in the French language, whether from Africa and the Caribbean, and especially as it related to poetry. I think one of the fascinating aspects of this is precisely the comparative angle that's been mentioned before, and the dialogue that he establishes between Caribbean literature and African literature. But this was done, many years ago, before things such as world literature became, mainstream, and this dialogue, became more present, even within conferences, for example, of the African Literature Association. So I'm not actually saying much, except that the connections between the local and the global that we've been talking about is really something that he does very successfully. And in a way, what I was saying is he unlike many other scholars, he does it through the text in a way that is very much what literature or what literary scholarship should be like. You start from the text, and then you put all this together with the philosophical angle, which was absolutely fascinating in this book as well, because we talked about Francophone literature, it's also Francophone philosophy. So the dialogue established between all these different fields is perhaps, it's something that I found very impressive, is the scope of the scholarship. It's not narrow. I consider myself to be someone from a generation who focuses on more narrow, more narrow field of study, whereas this has really a very, very broad and impressive scope. But maybe other panelists have more to say about this aspect of the book.
Dr. Omonigo, are you also a scholar of French?
Yes, I am.
And were you a student of Irele?
He thought my professor. He thought I'm a student, or I was a student of his. So I'm like a granddaughter of Irele.
Yes. Yeah. And I think these lineages, you use that same metaphor, are really so fascinating, and in fact would make a really interesting article to just map the histories of French teaching in Nigeria, for example. What was on the syllabus? Who taught it? What students were there? What did they go on to be? And there's a worldliness in Prof. Irele's work, which he obviously handed on to people like Adejunmobi, and it sounds like to you, Dr. Omonigo, as the next generation. I find these really fascinating lineages.
Absolutely correct.
And French speakers who are able to access English, and English speakers who are able to access French stand at a sort of crossroads in African literature. Of course, there's also other crossroads, the crossroads of Yoruba and English, or Igbo and Yoruba, or, there are many crossroads. But the English-French border is one that not many people can cross. And Adejunmobi and Irele do cross it.
Does it? Absolutely.
Tell us what you work on, Dr. Omonigo.
Actually, I worked on Francophone African drama, but I remember that when I was in the university, my graduate school, we learned so much about one of his books, The Negritude Moment, where he actually, just like Dr. Tunka said, where he did a kind of comparison between the African literature and the Caribbean literature, and you put in the negritude in perspective, and how that